Welcome to another episode of the .NET Show. For this episode, Eric and I have come down to Los Angeles to the Microsoft Professional Developers Conference. While we're down here, we had a chance to talk to some attendees, some speakers, as well as doing some filming. In fact, we actually filmed a live episode of the .NET Show in front of a live studio audience. For this particular episode, we invited in some of the speakers from some of the presentations, and in fact, people that have spoken in previous episodes of the .NET Show to help share some experiences about what they do for .NET and answer questions from our live studio audience. So in a few minutes, we'll get into the live episode of the .NET Show, but first, let's check in with Erica and the news.
Hello, I'm Erica Wiechers. Welcome to the MSDN News Update. Microsoft recently announced plans to allow its passport authentication service to interoperate with enterprises, network, and other services in order to provide a secure method for supporting single sign-in applications. Passport will use the industry-proven Kerberos standard to provide open and federated authentication amongst multiple organizations. Support for single sign-in is expected to be available by next year. In October, Microsoft released the Visual Studio.NET release candidate. This release was first distributed at the Professional Developers Conference in Los Angeles and signals the impending release of Visual Studio.NET. With the release candidate, Microsoft is also distributing smart device extensions and the .NET Compact framework, which target application development for smart devices. Also in October, MSDN launched 3 new developer centers for UDDI, .NET My Services, and Tablet PC. The new developer centers provide documentation, technical articles, downloads, and other resources for these important new technologies. On October 25th, Microsoft launched its latest operating system, Windows XP, from New York. The event was telecast live to the attendees of the 2001 PDC in Los Angeles. Special guests included Mayor Rudy Giuliani, Regis Philbin, and Sting, who performed a live concert in Bryant Park. Windows XP is the first consumer version of Windows based on NT technologies. And that's been the MSDN News Update. I'm Erica Wiechers.
Welcome back to the .NET Show, live from the PDC. We're doing something interesting this time and actually having a live studio audience for the very first time, hopefully allowing them to ask some really great questions of my audience, of my guests I've got here today. And for my guests, I've got Mark Lucovsky, Mark Anders, and Mark Boulter, so the 3 Marks and me. Before we get into things, what I'd like to do is quickly ask each one of you to just kind of introduce what the key topic is you provide to the whole .NET family. Mark?
I'm the newcomer to the .NET family. My team does the .NET My Services, the XML web services that are user-centric to provide things like calendar information, address books, and I'm just actually building web services where these guys are building the plumbing that lets me develop web services.
So my name is Mark Anders, and I am responsible for the .NET framework, which includes things like ASP.NET for building web applications and services, all of the base class libraries that you use for representing data and building programs. And a key part of that is Windows Forms, which Mark is responsible for.
Hi, I'm Mark Boulter, and I'm responsible for Windows Forms, which is the piece of the .NET framework that you use to build smart client applications. And one of the key things we've done with the .NET framework is solve DLL hell and solve the deployment issues that you have with distributing client applications today.
So by adding all these capabilities, you have the Windows Forms sort of stuff. We have the services, the back-end services, not just the services infrastructure, but the actual providing of the services. And then we kind of have the services infrastructure and everything that ties everything together. I think it's a pretty good representation of what's going on. Mark Lucovsky. It's going to be hard getting
Call me Dr. Hailstorm.
Okay, Dr. Hailstorm. From what you've been talking to with the audiences at different talks you've been doing, what do you think have been some of the key things that have been resonating to them about the .NET My Services?
I think most people are getting it and understanding what it is we're trying to deliver. I mean, you have to remember that it's been NDA up until this PDC, so we really didn't have the opportunity to tell everybody the story and what the services were. So all they knew about what we were doing is the fragments they would read in this magazine or that newspaper. And now that we are telling them exactly what the programming model looks like, what the data model looks like, we've given them bits that they can use. They're, starting to get excited about how they're going to use them in their applications, and they know, where we're going.
What do you think they're most excited about in these pieces?
I think the ability to have that information available to them through programmatic means is great. I think most people are super excited about that, about being able to easily integrate the kind of information that we deliver into their applications. I think they're excited about using the XML in its natural state, and I think they're excited about getting started with web services with some real useful web services coming from Microsoft.
Now, earlier I saw you using a little two-way pager thing for doing some email stuff like that. Some people in the audience
it's called Pickleberry.
Pickleberry, okay. How soon do you think it will be before some of these random devices we have will actually be integrating with the .NET My Services?
Well, I think in the case of the BlackBerry, you're already there with email, and the BlackBerry tab actually has mail, address book, calendar. It has the ability to have tasks and notes and stuff. These are all the basic services that we provide with Hailstorm. So taking their present product, they already have a gateway architecture. They can already talk to the network, and extending that to the sorts of services that we have. It's just around the corner for a company that's already in that state. So I'm excited. I hope it happens soon. I'll pay more per month, for those services on my Huckleberry.
When I talk with people that are just kind of for the first time hearing about the .NET My Services, and they hear about a calendar and inbox and document storage and all that sort of stuff, they kind of say, that sounds like an application. I mean, so does that mean that Microsoft is just going to totally own this as an application market and no one else can innovate on things? Yeah,
it's not at all an application, because what we're providing is the back-end data, the faceless, headless data, and to turn it into an application, you have to write UI and data manipulation logic that sits on top. So a calendar becomes a calendar when it starts looking like a calendar, when you can start scheduling events, and you need forms packages either running on the client side or the server side to provide that fluffy window dressing on top of our hardcore XML storage system.
So, Mark, that's probably a good lead-in for you then.
Well, thank you.
Providing the back-end framework stuff that people actually are writing the application code, whether for a web form or a Windows form or something like that, accessing the .NET My Services. How do you see all that tying together?
Well, it ties together very, very well, and you can take Visual Studio today, which actually targets the .NET framework, and point at a My Services, at any of the My Services, and you actually get a very good experience for being able to query, being able to pull down the data, being able to update it. So all of it fits together really well because it's all built on XML web services. So it ties together very well.
Mm-hmm. Now, so the .NET framework running on a server is able to allow the web server to take and provide those pages up and write an ASP code or ASP.NET code. Now,
exactly.
On the client, what's all needed on the client for getting some of the functionality?
Well, it depends on the type of app that you're writing. If you're building something with ASP.NET, sort of a server-based application, you don't need anything on the client. You just need a web browser. And ASP.NET has really great support for not only rich DHTML browsers, but also HTML3.2 browsers. So you can use any browser on the PC, as well as a wide variety of mobile devices. So it's very, very easy to build an application that projects out to Windows XP and take advantage of all the functionality that the browser supports there, down-level browsers on any other platform, as well as creating a mobile view of that application that allows you to get it on your cell phone or your PDA or whatever. So we really handle a wide variety of different form factors that you can project out to. And all of those you can build in a really nice WYSIWYG fashion using Visual Studio.NET, which again targets it and has great designer support for all of the mobile stuff. Now, you can also build rich Windows applications with a very, very similar programming model using Windows forms, which is what Mark is responsible for.
And I guess you can call me Dr. Fluffy.
Dr. Fluffy.
Without a dingle.
Yeah, no. So I'm actually really excited about my services. I'm itching to get back to my office and sit down and start building some Windows Forms applications against it. I think it's going to be a great opportunity for, if you look at the kind of control market there is today for ActiveX controls, a lot of those guys are now building ASP.NET or Windows Forms controls. And in fact, if you go down to the expo, you can see there are a whole set of vendors down there who have grids and cool bars and all sorts of interesting controls that target Windows Forms and ASP.NET. And so I think one of the great things they'll be able to do is like provide calendar controls and scheduling controls and mailbox controls that target my services. So from my point of view, it's a great business opportunity for people.
Now with your code, since it's the Windows Form, that's actually requiring some stuff to be loaded on the client as well. You're not just coming through a web browser.
So we do need a little bit more than a web browser. What you need to do is to install the .NET Framework Redist on the client. But once you have that, of course, you don't have to actually install anything else after that. For instance, you can deploy. Hopefully, you all saw Anders Heilsberg in the keynote on Monday demonstrate this. You can copy your Windows Forms application to a web server, create a little HTML page with a link on it to that exe. And when you click on that link, it'll actually just download and run. And because of the code access security infrastructure in the .NET Framework, that's a safe thing to do. If you're downloading code from the internet or the intranet, there are certain things it's not allowed to do, like ferret around your hard drive and find your credit card information, send it off to somebody else who's going to destroy your credit rating by spending it on inappropriate things.
Another key aspect of that code download is that it doesn't just download a single exe.
Yeah.
You can download just a small piece of your application, and as it references other pieces, those will also be brought down. And a cache is maintained on your PC, so if you already have the latest version of that, it will be used out of the cache. And so it really combines sort of the web, the zero TCO that you have with the web, but with rich functionality.
Yes.
The other thing I was going to mention is really two things. One is that we have prototypes that we've done of controls that modify, for example, the existing calendar controls and sit on top of the My Services. So that's actually very, very easy to do. And
so that means, like, if I was a programmer right now using some of the existing calendar controls, I could just install this new control and suddenly I'd have access to My Services?
Yeah.
But conceptually, it's no different than data binding to
Correct.
a live web service rather than
Yes.
a
I mean,
static
it's
database.
actually something that you can do today with the existing controls. This just wraps up formalizing the data binding to make it a little bit easier. The other thing that we've been experimenting with is building things like an email client application that uses web services, and we'll go against the .NET My Services. Because the .NET Framework has a lot of stuff for doing asynchronous programming. So you can develop really rich clients. All of the web services support is built in, and so you can very, very easily build rich applications that target the My Services. And we've been experimenting with that.
How would an application going against the My Services inbox be different than something like Hotmail? Or is it the same thing as Hotmail?
Well, it would be different from Hotmail in that you could be using Windows Forms and building a rich client application, so you have all the information locally, it gets it asynchronously, so rather than having to say, here are the first 20 headers, you can bring up the app and it shows you the first 20 headers, and then in the background it's downloading the rest of the headers, but you can interact with it.
So it's not like a web email program, it's an email program whose data just is not on the local hard drive, it's on the network somewhere.
Correct. Now you can also create a web front end as well, which would be similar to something like Hotmail.
Now, one of the issues is getting the .NET Framework onto the client machines, as you can do in Windows Forms applications. What issues and concerns do we have about how we're going to manage that capability? I mean, because like Windows XP, which shipped today, doesn't include the .NET Framework on it.
Correct. It's kind of similar to how people have installed runtimes for a variety of languages. Windows did not ship with the VB runtime, and people would just install that and then they would have that on their machines. The good thing about it is that though the install is not insignificant, it's megabytes of code, there's so much functionality in there that when you build applications, they tend to be very, very small. I've been looking at a lot of the sort of WinForms applications that we've built, and very often they're like 40K or 85K.
What allows them to be so small?
Well, the fact that the framework itself contains so much functionality that you're building on.
And then how does all that tie into the .NET My Services? Do you require the .NET framework to be on the system?
We don't require anything to be on the system. Anybody that can build a SOAP envelope can play with us and send messages. Now, obviously, if somebody builds a calendar control that can data bind to our services, it's that much easier to access the calendar service. If somebody builds a forms package that lets you build a contact picker or deal with our stuff, it's that much easier. So when you get back to the why is the application so small, if the base library has the ability to build those envelopes and interact with the data and rip it apart and present it as an object tree, then the application doesn't have to carry along that functionality with itself. So but you don't have to use any of the stuff to talk to .NET My Services. It just makes it better if you do use it.
That's a key part of the message. XML web services are an inherently open technology. You don't have to use any Microsoft software whatsoever. You can have a Linux box with Perl, and you can talk just fine to the My Services. What we've tried to do with the .NET framework is create a platform that makes your development experience richer and better than if you were using something like Perl. But the core technology is very, very open, and we've created a great implementation of a development platform that goes against that in a very native way and makes it feel very natural.
So Mark Lucovsky, have people on your team been actually writing applications not on Windows that are accessing some of the .NET My Services?
Yeah, in fact, this morning we demonstrated the ability to send an alert to .NET My Services, and the alert generator was running on FreeBSD. We've called services from Solaris in Java, Perl, and C, from Linux in Java, Perl, and C, from Windows in C and Perl. I don't think we did it in Java from Windows. We did it from JavaScript, from VBScript, from C#.
I actually showed it running on FreeBSD with Python.
Python, that's a first. Using the framework or just a Python?
No,
Python,
this is on FreeBSD.
Yeah, I mean, basically any device that has any kind of network connectivity and an ability to concatenate strings and shoot it out the network can talk to our services.
That's really the beauty of all of this stuff, is that, and I think is one of the same drivers of the web success. Because it's built on these very, very easy to understand protocols, you can sit there in a telnet session and just connect up to that port and type in your own, network packet. You don't even need software that knows anything about the protocol. So it's very, very open and easy and very flexible to do lots of amazing things with.
Now, sometimes when you're hearing people talk about, open and easy and flexible and stuff going across the network and applications running across the network, security bells start ringing. What sort of thoughts and concerns are there regarding security and the .NET Framework, Windows Forms, or the .NET
For our services, we require that the message carry an authenticated license that identifies the sender of the message. If it doesn't carry that license, it's not a valid message and it's rejected. So we don't really have the concept of anonymous messages coming in. They have to be well-formed XML, and they have to be schema valid with respect to what our service expects. And part of that is there's a license that has to be an authenticated license that is a Kerberos ticket encrypted with a key that we're programmed to understand. So, that's the starting point, is identifying the sender of a message. Once we have the sender of the message in hand, then we can start, doing the authorization to say, is this sender allowed to perform this operation? So I think that you can be very, very open and very safe at the same time.
So that provides a level of security of the data that's being stored.
The data and
for the
access
user.
to the service, yeah.
Yeah. So, Mark Anders, about security regarding the .NET framework itself, since that allows code to be passed back and forth, like the Terrarium example application we've seen. The game is actually, you're taking your code and running on someone else's machine. What are some of the issues there, security-wise?
Well, security was, I would say, perhaps the number one feature that we worked on throughout the product cycle. And next month actually marks my 4th year working on the .NET framework. So I've been working on this for a long time, and security was designed in from the very beginning. We have a very sophisticated code access security model that takes evidence about the code, where it came from, whether the publisher is known, and then takes that evidence that comes from a variety of places and checks the policy that has been set up for that code by the host. So in the case of Terrarium, what we've done is we've severely limited what that code can do. You can only call a certain number of APIs because there's, number one, you don't want the code to be able to do something, naughty like format your disk or, delete some critical system files. Number two, it's a game. And you want to set up the rules of the game, and we can actually constrain that through code access security. So we've done a lot of work to have the infrastructure that allows you to host code in a very, very safe way. We've actually done a lot of other things about security throughout the framework. We have all of the encryption classes for example, talking to Hailstorm. We have support for all of the Windows stuff. Doing SSL over a socket. So there are a variety of ways that you can use either the code access security or the encryption things. In ASP.NET, there's a pluggable security system that lets you integrate Passport or even create your own set of role mappings for like handling a web request.
So in regards to like a Terrarium type of application, now is it the Terrarium host application that's controlling the security of the modules it's running?
It's always the host application that sets up the policy, and it's the thing, it configures the security engine and sets up the boundaries so that when code tries to do something, if it tries to access something that is protected, and really anything that accesses the native system requires a security check. Mm-hmm. Even things like being able to get a pointer. The .NET framework, supports C++ code. Even the ability to do that is a security request. And so that goes up and it walks the stack to see if anyone has that. And the only one who can actually really grant that is the host.
Mm-hmm. Or now, can the user control the security access to the application?
Yes.
Or the IT administrator or something like that.
Exactly.
So then the application can't get any more security than I choose to give it, and the modules within it can't get any more usage than what the application and I choose to give it.
Correct.
Okay. So, Mark Boulter, do you have any things to add to that, or?
I was just going to say, I think one of the important things, certainly in a corporate environment, is the fact that the security decisions are now being made according to that policy, and that policy can be controlled and set by the administrators and the security administrators inside the corporation. So rather than having a model where when you want to run a piece of code that's being downloaded onto your machine, it pops up a dialog that says, do you want to run this code or not? And it's the end user making that decision. In a corporate environment, quite often the end user, a typical end user, doesn't have enough context to understand that the security implications of the decision they're making. And so with code access security, because it's the code access security policy that's controlled by systems administrators that makes that determination, it makes it a much safer environment to be downloading code.
That's what, that does bring up interesting issues, that anytime you're going to give the user administrator control over setting security issues, the user interface is probably extremely important, as how you explain it to people. I know people have asked me that about the .NET My Services and the various ways of accessing authorization and stuff like that, and probably even with the .NET framework, stuff like that. What sort of work are we doing regarding just the user interface that has really nothing to do with the functionality of the framework?
So I think in this release, our focus has really been on making sure we solve the corporate environment problem. We do have a set of wizards that you can use in that ship as part of the framework that an end user can use. But I think that's an area that we could certainly do more usability work on in the future. But because our focus in this release was really to get to the point where in a corporation, the systems administrators and the security administrators were comfortable about having this model for allowing code to be downloaded onto client machines and executed, and making sure that we had the infrastructure in place that allowed you to differentiate between the rights that a user has and the rights that the code running on their machine has.
Now, one of the key things, though, is that we do tie into things like Active Directory, and there are a lot of administration tools for controlling policy, and so we piggyback off that. So it's really building off of what Windows has and extending that to an exciting new area of code.
So, Mark Lucovsky, how does that fall into what .NET My Service is doing just from the whole UI authentication stuff?
With .NET My Services, we have the challenge of having a pretty sophisticated security system that allows you to be very, very expressive in who you want to share, how much you want to share, when you want to share, why you want to share, and distilling that down to a simple question that a regular user, a 14-year-old girl or a 22-year-old college student can safely say, yes, this matches my intent. So we're folding in intentions from the application, underlying capabilities of the system, so that if you want to share your profile in a read-only way, it's very, very easy. If you want to step up a notch and say, I only want to share it, for the next 2 hours, that's a little bit harder, but not a stretch. If you want to do more sophisticated things like, I want to share my email address, but I don't want to share this screen name, it's all possible, but the UI challenge takes you more into the advanced realm. So, we're still experimenting with the exact, balance and where the boundary line is between what we present in our standard consent UI and how much of the underlying system we actually open up.
Because I suppose conceivably you could have a pretty complex scenario in which, I want to share this with my father, but only when he's running from his own computer, except if it's Tuesday, because I know he's running from an internet machine I accept, and all that sort of stuff.
And if I did the UI, I'd just have like a radio button for every one of those choices, and you just be click, 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 click.
I just have a command prompt. You can just kind of type in that.
Well, or you could do it in Hess,
Yeah, okay.
That's why we keep Mark away from those kind of things.
Well, I think we've covered a pretty good area of what's involved in the whole .NET framework and the .NET My Service and things like that. And so I'd like to think about opening up to the audience for questions here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple seconds and we're going to make sure the microphones are set in the audience, and then we'll come right back with questions from our live studio audience here at the PDC.
What does my mom think I'm doing? I don't know. I think my mom thinks I'm like, playing around with computers.
What she thinks .NET is the thing that keeps me from calling her every Sunday to tell her how I'm doing.
My mother would probably say I do something with computers.
It's very difficult to explain to people what you do when you're in the business of creating tools.
It's funny. I tried at some point to give my parents a good analogy of what I do.
When you say I'm working on tools, people don't understand enough about how programming is done to know what tools are.
And I tried to explain to them in terms of, there's the water tower over there on the hill, and then I have like a water tank close to me.
She knows that I work at Microsoft, and she believes that I can answer any question about any Microsoft product that was ever created.
I think he's something with construction.
I get hot water because it's in a tank close to me, and that's the way the whole things work.
My mom is not an average Microsoft mom.
She scratches her head. She goes, okay, I didn't really get that, but I know you don't build water tanks for a living. And at that point, I just gave up.
I'm not sure what she thinks I do anymore because I haven't talked to her in a while.
I don't know. I guess I could call her.
Well, welcome back to the .NET Show, live from the PDC. We're now going to get a chance to take some live questions from our studio audience. So let's go on with the first question. First question?
My name's Chris, and thanks for taking my questions. One of the questions that I have as I'm thinking about the possibilities of web services is why would I use and how could I use a web service when I need always available functionality? Obviously, there's some failure points through the web. You know, if I need passport authentication, things of this nature, why and how do I take advantage of web services in an app that demands 100% always available functionality?
Now, was that question for Mark or Mark?
That question is for the panel as a whole.
All right, let me take the first shot, because that question is no different than the question people have been asking me for years with Windows. And the question in Windows is, you guys have a million APIs, why would I use them all? And the answer is that I hope you don't use them all, and I hope you only use web services where they naturally fit into your application. If you don't have a need to get information or deal with information that's out there on the global internet, if you demand fully local, fully isolated operation, then web services probably don't fit into that part of your application. But I bet if you look at your application a little bit more broadly, there are external touch points where information and services that are available on the internet do fit in, and you should use the web services in those contexts. But clearly, don't do the web math library that Anders showed you guys in the keynote. That would be a stupid idea of a family of web services, because that's the kind of thing that is best done locally, not best done as a web service. But other things like, let's say that you're writing a scheduling application and you need access to my calendar. You're not going to have that information locally, and by presenting it as a web service, at least you have an opportunity to get that information if it fits into your application. So,
I would actually augment that, because in another way, this is no different than a lot of the other information that we use all the time on our computers, right? For example, when I'm at work, I log in and my identity is validated on the network, right? And yet if I take my machine home, which I actually do all the time, and I have my machine backstage, I can actually still log on. And the way that works is that the identity is cached. Right, and so there's enough information to access the data to verify that I'm who I say I am, given my password, offline. Right. Same thing with something like Outlook. Right, I can at work be connected, and I have all of my email available on a real-time basis. But I can also take a cache of that data offline and have access to it. Now, clearly, you can't have access to something that you've never accessed before if it only lives on the net. But there's lots of sophisticated things that have been done. Windows XP has offline folders so that I can even connect to a file share, and transparently, if I've gone to that file share, it will synchronize those files and make them available to me offline. If it's something that I've never looked at, I obviously can't do that. And Hailstorm has built into it mechanisms and design patterns for how to do caching of that calendar information, and how to then, when you connect up, know if your cache is fresh or not. So I think that's a little bit more of the puzzle.
Okay, next question.
Hi guys, my name is Jonathan Frost. I'm the CEO and founder of Aviga eLearning Solutions, and my question for you is, what do you think are some of the benefits that the .NET framework and microservices would have for e-learning and web-based training as compared to J2EE?
Well, that's interesting. I know that in the case of Hailstorm, we've had
.NET My Services.
.NET My Services, I'm sorry. We've had, Bob said I could say Hailstorm.
Okay, maybe just you.
Okay. We've had some people actually looking at doing a family of services around education. What they wanted to do was somehow model the teacher's view of the school environment and then the student's view. And they were trying to design, schemas and data models for what's a teacher's view. A teacher has a class roster, an array of classes, and classes have assignments, and assignments have due dates. So they were trying to model that, the teacher's view, and then also at the same time model the student's view where they complete assignments and check them in and get grades. So I think that a family of services that have a similar interface style would be very helpful to web-based training and even, you know, traditional school system and education. Beyond that part of the training thing in the school system, I think schools themselves benefit greatly from our services because schools typically have a staff directory, and when they present that staff directory as an HTML page, you don't have good search capability. You can't process it. You can't pack and go their address book and get at it with your address book viewer that's based on our service interfaces. So clearly that kind of service for the school should be a web service, and the same with their calendar. You know, they have the soccer practice days and the game days and the half-day schedules, all of that, making that all programmable so that we can render it with our cool calendar apps would be beneficial.
Okay, so I'll add on to that and say that what a lot of that boils down to is the fact that the My services are based on XML web services. And I think when you look at web-based training or web-based anything, having open standard formats that you can represent data in are a very good thing. And Java as a platform has not really been about that. They have some support for XML, but they've really been more about things like, you know, Genie for device discovery, which is based on, you know, Java being at both ends. Things like RMI, which is all about object remoting and actually a very stateful, non-web-like architecture. Now, that's why I think web services are the thing you want to do. Now, you can do web services with J2EE. It actually takes a lot of work, as maybe you've discovered. The .NET Framework is a platform that we've built from the ground up, number one, to support web services. Number two, to allow you to develop and consume those services in any language. So if you're someone who knows C++, or you know COBOL, or you know Java, or you know Visual Basic, or you know Perl, Python, or Objective-Camel, or any of you know, over 20 different languages, you can build solutions that both create that data and consume that data. Also, for building web applications, we're actually have much better performance than Java, and we've shown some of those numbers at the PDC here. It's a much more productive environment, and so I think there are a lot of different advantages.
Yeah. So I'd just add to that, the other great thing about the .NET Framework is that it used to be you had to choose between building applications that were based on HTML and Windows applications, and with HTML you got deployment for free, and with Windows applications you got more flexibility. And one of the .NET things the .NET Framework gives you is that doesn't have to be the deciding factor anymore. You can choose which is most appropriate. So, for instance, if you're building a web-based training application, you can have a lot of the application that's HTML, but you could also have some parts of it that use, say, a Windows Forms control, and you can even write ASP.NET controls where you can detect whether the runtime's on the client or not, and say, well, if the runtime's on the client, then I'll download this control onto the user's machine, and then maybe they can use the training application offline, but they still get the auto-update capabilities that you have with HTML. But if they don't have the .NET Framework on the client, well, I'm going to render it as HTML, and they can use it online, but not offline.
Yeah, another key thing is that the programming model for building client-based applications with Windows Forms or server-based applications with ASP.NET is actually very, very similar. And this was one of the challenges we faced when we first started working on ASP.NET 4 years ago. It was really, you know, how do you build great WYSIWYG tools that allow you to build web front ends, for example? How do you have a component model? And with ASP, we didn't really have a robust enough architecture to allow you to do those types of things. It was actually very, very difficult. JSP, which is a key component of J2EE, is very similar to ASP. In fact, there is one word difference, active or Java. And We spent 4 years trying to come up with a better, more powerful architecture. And already, we're just still in beta 2, and there are 10 books out about ASP.NET. There are over 30 more in the pipeline coming out in the next couple of months. There are 50 sites devoted to ASP.NET on the web in America, in Great Britain, in France, in Spain, in China, in I think even Czechoslovakia I saw.
Yeah.
So people are looking at it and saying, wow, this really, we've been building on that model of ASP with sort of the inline code for the last 4 years, 5 years, and we really want something better. And they've been looking at ASP.NET and saying that really does it. Fortunately for us, or unfortunately for Java, they really kind of looked at what we did and said, that's what we're going to do, but they looked at what we were doing 5 years ago. And so I think that there's, from a productivity standpoint, just huge advantages to building web applications and services. And as we've shown, you can take the new Emacs and develop a web service trivially using the .NET framework, and that would be quite a bit of work to do with a J2EE server.
It really is. It's unbelievably powerful and easy. I realized I knew nothing about ASP+, and I got put in this job, and I thought, well, the first thing I should do is build a web service, or just build a page that uses ASP+. And
ASP.NET was the old name.
Oh.
He's still in Hailstorm land. Mark is about,
what do we call it now?
ASP.NET.
ASP.NET. So
we keep Mark in like a little time capsule where we dust him off and he says,
the old names.
Yeah,
We just pick a name and keep with it. I'd be
on my
okay.
thing, which is the XP code.
I am running Whistler.
Working on Hailstorm with ASP+.
And I was
Very
running
good.
NT5 before that. But I mean, these guys, literally, Mark and Scott send me a code fragment saying, okay, this is where you put your code, this is where you put your HTML, and this is kind of what a control looks like. And you can take, a 10-line fragment, 3-file fragment, and be up and running instantly. And as a C programmer, it makes sense that you have, okay, here's my code, here's my UI. You don't have them all intermixed and thinking that, okay, now I get a little script block that happens, and then a little HTML comes out the side. So it's really natural, and it's the way you as a programmer would expect to stitch it together. So I
echo that. I think ASP.NET is incredible. I mean, the guys on my team who are all pretty hardcore Windows developers, they've all got their own little websites, and they started using ASP.NET, and they're just blown away by it. Absolutely incredible. The fact that it's a control-based architecture, that controls have properties of methods and fire events, it just works really, really well. It's an enormous step forward for building web-based applications.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Okay. Next question.
Hi, my name is Andy Hopper. We do medical informatics software where I work. We've been, just to give you a little anecdote, we've been live for the past 2 months with a ASP.NET based website that's using the .NET framework and SQL Server 2000 for the back end. We couldn't be happy with it. The extensibility is great. We're using custom controls for many portions of our pages, and we're using performance-based authentication for authenticating our users. Now on to my question. Since it's clinical information that we're retrieving, doctors and the clinical information systems departments are paranoid about security, and what with HIPAA coming down the line, the full force of the federal government is going to be behind it. What can I do, or what resources are available to prove to both myself and to the doctors that the whole .NET framework is going to be secure enough to transfer this information?
That's a really good question. In terms of actually convincing somebody that it's secure enough. I think some of it is emphasizing the existing standards that it already builds on, and the technologies that those things are based. Mark was talking about the My Services authentication using Kerberos. We can encrypt channels of communication with SSL and technologies, that are already proven, right? There are new standards that build on that for things like XML signing, so that you can make sure that, if a hospital sends a medical record, even if it's in a format like XML, where someone could just, take Notepad and change something in the medical record, that with XML signing, what you can do is actually verify that, number one, the message came from who it says it came from, and number two, that the message has not been modified. So there are a bunch of standards that the .NET Framework supports, and I think those are some of the most powerful ways, because it builds on existing standards that are proven.
Let me add to that a little bit. If you were at Eric Rudder's keynote, one of the things that they talked about was GXA, the Global Web Services Architecture, and in the security section of that, the set of security headers, there's two very important headers for dealing with confidentiality and message integrity. In our product, we use both of those headers, and the framework is committed to adding support for those headers. And with those in place, you can define in your web service interface language that I mandate an integrity header. And once you've mandated an integrity header, that message must be digitally signed in both directions. Like, you can mandate a confidentiality header with a transform that spans body, header, whatever's right for your message, and now that message must be encrypted in flight. So you get confidentiality or encryption, and then you get signing on top of that to guarantee that the message is hidden and hasn't been tampered with. And the framework will support those headers as those specifications stabilize. And in our product, we use both of those. So, we carry encrypted bodies, and we have digital signatures over a wide portion of the message. So.
And one of the issues there is to pay attention to what exactly are the requirements coming into the question. I remember a while back I was talking with a company that they were looking at using Passport as their authentication mechanism. In their requirements documentation, it specifically stated no third-party authentication mechanisms allowed. And so with a requirement like that, on the face of it, that would remove Passport or anybody else from providing the authentication. And then you almost want to go back to the people that actually wrote the requirements. Okay, why exactly are you saying this? And what are the hoops someone can jump through in order to change this to get it available? Because at a certain extent, security, there's no such thing as full security. But there are such things as having enough security to satisfy the needs of the requirements of the individuals involved. Next question.
So my name is Darcy Berner. As someone with Microsoft on my badge, I've been wandering around this week as fair game to developer questions, and I keep getting variations of the same question over and over again. The question is basically, how do we get there from here? That is, the .NET My Services and the .NET Framework describe a very different programming model than the one developers are currently using. What's the process to migrate from the way that they're building applications now to the way that we're telling them they ought to be building applications using the .NET Framework and using the .NET My Services?
Okay, well, from the .NET Services perspective, I disagree. I don't think that the programming model is that much different than what they're doing today. I mean, anybody that's doing, web-based programming is very comfortable, I would assume, with dynamic HTML generation and generating that HTML using either row sets coming out of a database or XML islands that are coming out of files or coming out of blobs out of databases. What we're doing with our services is taking it to the next level and saying those chunks of XML are coming to you live in a web service channel. So instead of calling your database connector, you shoot a message to us and we'll give you back the XML. You can cache it if you need to cache it. But the hard part of the problem isn't, formatting the message and going off and interacting with the web service. I think the hard part is making sure the data comes in a way that you understand it, and that you can do the same kind of generation of your app logic or your client-side script or your static HTML based on our live data feeds. So I just don't see it as being all that different. When I work with ASP Plus, data binding to static stuff and data bind to our dynamic information, it doesn't change anything that I do. And if I write client-side script in DHTML or in command line mode, it doesn't change anything. It's all very easy.
I actually see it as just another sort of step on the path that we've been taking for the last, X years, where X is in, tens of years in terms of computer science. We continually build on things that we did previously, right? So I remember when I first started programming in Windows in 1986, and it was sort of a wild new thing because there was all these events, these Windows messages flowing around, and all of these very, very different concepts, but I could still use, the language that I use, C, and I could learn those concepts. Really what we've done, I think, is taken a lot of things that are very familiar. So if you look at, for example, VB.NET, it's very, very familiar. There are some new concepts. You have things like inheritance. You have things like web services. But in each of those, we've looked and we've said, what is really good from the past that we want to bring forward? And so, for example, when you create a web service, you can just say, I'm going to make a class, and I'm going to have a method on that class, and that gets called, right? So if I wanted to add two numbers, I just write an add method that takes two integers, adds them together, and sends it out. There's no difference.
I use a plus sign. Use the add method? Just use a plus sign?
Yes. I mean, that's just a simple example.
Okay.
Mark is just in his own little world here.
No, every time you guys use that example, add, I'm thinking, somebody's going to do that. And I don't want to see that.
It's good enough for admins. It must be good enough for the rest.
See, what I've been trying to do is actually convince Mark that there's real business value in that, add web service, and that he'll, leave his position at Microsoft, and I'll take over for him.
We're
to start the ad.com.
We'll do add and subtract.
And in V2, they're going to come out with multiplication.
Yeah. And I'm going to hire somebody to do shift.
Okay, very good. Getting down to that little, but all of this stuff we're able to model on top of the things we already know. If you're building web applications today, and that, when people started doing it, was a very different thing, right? It was, in many ways harder to do than a Windows application. You couldn't use tools like VB just to drag some controls and do it. You had, maintaining the state, but people actually picked it up very, very rapidly, and that's why you see people developing web applications all over the world. This is really building on all of those things. So instead of HTML, it's using XML, but it's using HTTP and all of the common programming models that we have. It makes development, if you talk to some of the developers here at the conference who were COM developers, for example, the answer from how do I get, from where I am today to here is forget about all the plumbing code you had to write. It's just much, much simpler. And that's why we're seeing companies like Verizon, for example, who after September 11th had to get their systems up and running to rebuild what had been, physically very, very damaged. And they were able to develop in 6 days what it used to take them 6 months to develop. So I think a lot of the angst that you have from people about, how do I get there from here, is sort of initially when they haven't really looked at using the technology. When you get VisualStudio.net and you start programming in VB.net, when you try and learn C#, the thing I hear overwhelmingly from people is, wow, this stuff is really easy to use, it's powerful. We just heard from a customer a couple of minutes ago whose app was deployed, on beta software. So they were able to learn the concepts, get up and running, deploy it on the internet, and so I say try it.
One question I've heard along the same lines is that if you're familiar with writing old Windows applications, all of a sudden you're trying to write for the .NET framework, suddenly the class libraries and namespace is just so totally different. How do you even find stuff out of it? Like if I'm going to do some sort of graphics app, and I'm used to doing a create palette, select palette, realize palette, or something like that, how do I find the equivalences in the .NET framework?
Well, I'm trying to think of, an analogy. I would say that it's much easier because you actually have hierarchical namespaces that organize the sets of objects that you use into logical groupings. So if you were to look at the .NET framework and said, I have no idea how any of this stuff works, and I'm going to look at the class library, and I want to do drawing, you'd look and you'd see system, and then you'd see system.drawing, and you might say, wow, maybe I should look in there. right? So we have much, much better organization than things had in the past. I was for many years a C programmer on Windows, and I got very used to the APIs, and I got used to looking through the things and saying, oh, this takes an HDC, so that means it's some GDI functions, or this takes a handle to a bitmap, so that must be bitmap functions, and that's how I grouped things, by sort of, looking at the parameters and trying to figure it out. This really distills it down into, I think, a much easier to find metaphor, and even though it's, it's kind of like, somebody used to cook something and they'd assemble all the ingredients individually, and now they can go out and buy some prepackaged stuff that has everything mixed together, so it makes it easy. You can still do the other stuff if you want, and certainly the details of exactly what those calls are, but we really tried to combine the things that you're familiar with lots of new power that's better organized.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that. I've been working with a set of control vendors to help them build Windows Forms controls and those kind of things. And, initially they were kind of looking at it going, well, with their kind of high hair standing on end and smoke coming out of their ears going, goodness me, or a phrase similar to goodness me. And, I was chatting to one of them, not at this conference, but at a previous one, and they had a team of guys who'd been working on, in this case, a C# version of their control. And they actually had to move them back to finish off the version they were just about to release that was written in C++. And one of the guys who runs the company was just saying to me, he was probably the most unpopular guy in the company because all of these developers wanted to go and work on Windows Forms and in C# because he was just so much better than doing the same kind of thing in C++. A lot of the kind of grunt templating type of work they had to do in C++ just wasn't there anymore. They just loved the environment. They loved the work, the way it was working. And we've heard that more and more from customers. And you've heard from the guy here who's deployed an ASP.NET application. I mean, that's a typical piece of feedback. And I think from the point of view of the guys coming from C++, there's the productivity advantages of the framework and the way it takes care of some of that housekeeping for you. From the point of view of people coming from a VB background, one of the great things is that the .NET framework as a platform is really designed with VB developers in mind. VB is a first-class citizen for targeting the .NET framework. And the fact that there are all these things you can do, and yes, there is some cost associated with understanding all of those things, like having a graphics library that you can use from VB without having to do declares, that allows you to do alpha blending and load all sorts of different image formats and all those kind of things. For me, some of the VB programs I've talked to is pretty exciting. And then the only other thing I want to mention is that we do have a good migration story. So, for example, in Windows Forms, you can still continue to use your existing ActiveX controls. If you have COM components, we have a really great way seamless way of using COM components from inside the .NET framework, or taking your .NET framework components and exposing those as COM components. And I mean, if you look at Visual Studio as an example of this, the Visual Studio shell itself is a very, very large C++ application. And then if the Windows Forms Designer and parts of the Web Forms Designer are written in C# and managed code using the .NET framework, and then we've used COM interop to glue those two things together. And the interfaces that Visual Studio exposes are not kind of fluffy OLE automation interfaces. I mean, they're hardcore, aimed at C++ guys, nasty, grungy IDL interfaces. You can't get much more hardcore than maybe OLEDB you can, but my point is that there's a really strong integration between COM and the .NET framework, and you can implement any arbitrary COM interface using the .NET framework, and vice versa. You can take a .NET framework component and expose it out of COM. So I think we have a pretty good migration story. You can preserve your existing investments. You can pick the pieces that make most sense to move to the .NET framework. And once you do that, the productivity gains you get and the power that you get as a result of that is pretty phenomenal.
Your question also assumes that the Windows DLL organization and function mapping was based on sound and rational thinking, and that is not the case at all, right? Kernel 32 had a hardcore requirement. It could not link to anything else. So take something like some of the registry APIs that had a need for, bits and pieces of other parts of the system. And why do you think we have a DLL called ADVAPI? I mean, it's supposed to be Advanced API. It was really more like get the registry stuff out of kernel 32 and give it a home where they feel loved. But it became a dumping ground for all sorts of DLLs. There's circular dependencies in the DLL set for ADVAPI. User has some stuff. User 32 has some APIs that don't belong in user 32. What did they have? Didn't they have some of the NLS functions and? Yeah, WSPrintf. I mean, how's that user 32? There's some internationalization, some locale stuff in user 32 that we had to reflect back into kernel 32. GDI was a mess. I mean, some of these DLLs and the entry points really reflect organizational boundaries, not boundaries that match what a programmer has to do. So I think the new organization, the hierarchy, is a much better way to organize things rather than ad hoc, oh, I'm already building this DLL, so I'll just export it from here approach of Windows.
But I think, the fundamental issue is when there is change, before you sort of cross that gap, it can seem a little scary. You're comfortable in the knowledge that you have. But some of it, when you look back a couple of years later, I remember when people used to write DOS applications and you'd write direct to the screen and you had to know how to, be able to work around the refresh thing so that your app scroll. I mean, you're giggling because you actually remember that.
Yeah, well, I've done it. I remember struggling to having to learn assembler language so I could do it.
And now, when was the last, and, you'd had something like Windows and it was like it's graphics, but how does it map to the refresh rate and all this? And you don't think about any of that stuff anymore. And I think it's really the same thing with this. It continually bumps up the abstraction level. And now, as you've heard from people who are actually using the framework and building applications, the types of questions that they have are sort of the next order of questions. How do I make sure that my site is secure? How do I do all of these things? Not, how do I add two numbers or sort a list of numbers or something like that. So I think it's just getting there.
Okay. Thanks. Plus. Next question.
Hi, my name is Sean Cox, and I was curious to know how a hailstorm application can become aware of a change in a user's data and what kind of cool things you foresee applications doing with that ability.
With Hailstorm, we have a subscription element that can be written into a service, and that subscription can contain a query string. So it becomes kind of a part query. And when something changes that is covered by that query, a notification can happen, and you can direct where you want that notification to go. So if somebody has decided to share with you their information in a way that allows you to write subscription elements in, you can dump in a subscription, and when a change occurs, you'll get a notification. And you can act on that programmatically. You can, obviously, the owner of the data can now see subscriptions that are pending against it, and the owner of that data can say, well, I don't want that guy stalking me, boom, and kill the subscription, or change the subscription, or delete the subscription. So you have a lot of control in who you allow to get dynamic updates, how those dynamic updates get delivered, and the user can decide if he wants to change his mind and cut off a dynamic update. So, pretty powerful.
One last question?
It's beautiful, some would say.
Hi, my name's David Brand. I had a question. It may not be directly related to development environments, but my company does custom Visio solutions, and we keep hearing things like, when am I going to be able to use Visio over the net? When can I use this custom Visio solution you're doing now, use this over the web? And I'm not sure if you guys know, are these things coming? I'm pretty sure there's a map point ActiveX control that's on the way. Are the other major Microsoft applications moving to a more web-based approach?
So I think the answer to that is yes. That's really what .NET is all about. It's about delivering software as a service. And where XML Web Services plug in is that's how you represent and move data, which is, always a critical part of any application. But I think that you'll see from all of the products that Microsoft puts out an emphasis on moving into more fully integrating with the net as a fundamental distribution mechanism, being able to access that information from any device and have roaming users and things like that. So I think you will. I don't know any specifics about Visio.
Yeah, I think I know there's some Excel development in this area too. I think that at the end of the day, we want to take things that are worthy of being exported as web services and do that, export them as web services. I mean, I think in the end of the day, we want to do the right thing if it's the right thing to do.
I mean, for the most part, the whole .NET evolution started out as a concept. And then from there, throughout the Microsoft company, the different parts of the company got the concept, embedded the concept within some of the applications they're working on. And then the first thing we saw coming out of it is just the framework you develop on and the tools necessary to develop. And once you have the tools and the framework and the languages, then the applications start being developed. So it's kind of an evolutionary process. But definitely, the whole concept of .NET is embedded totally within Microsoft from start to finish. And so you'll be seeing virtually every single application that should support .NET, supporting .NET in the very near future. Well, thanks for joining us. This was a very fun treat to have a live studio audience here for the .NET show. We've got a few more minutes left of the show, so pay attention, and we'll be right back.
This year's 2001 Professional Developer Conference has over 7,000 attendees, and a conference that size requires a lot of coordinating and planning. With me today is Ulf Schuh, a director at Microsoft and also the event owner of this year's PDC. Ulf, welcome.
Thank you.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about your group at Microsoft and what you do there?
I'm a director of evangelism, responsible for cross-group and company-wide coordination of evangelism activities in the different evangelism teams. So we have different groups at Microsoft that have created their own evangelism activities after we resolved or dissolved the BRG, the Microsoft Developers Relations Group. And so these groups pursue their evangelism mission on its own, and our group provides some sense and level of coordination. If you want to provide an analogy for it, it's something where we kind of like air traffic controllers. So we don't tell the evangelism teams how they should do their job. We don't tell them, how they fly their plane, how they hire their stewardesses, how they service their plane. But once they're up there in the air and once they're looking out for new business, we make sure that there's a good level of coordination so we all land good and new business safely.
Right, give them guidance.
Yeah.
So how long have you been at Microsoft?
Been at Microsoft nearly 8 years.
And what other types of jobs have you held before this one?
Before coming to Microsoft, I was for 5 years with Wang Systems in Germany, working for the European headquarters and doing network operations and consulting services.
So about the PDC, what does it take to put on a conference this size?
It's a lot of effort that goes into it, and once the show goes on site, it's definitely not seen by anyone, so I'm happy to talk about it. It took us about, starting in January, we laid it out what we wanted to do with the conference, and then we started to put the team together. And by the time we came here on site, we had about a 700 people team performing the different functions, from crew function, building up stages, sound, lighting, or from crew functions like stuffing the attendee bags. This is something really impressive. If someone has never seen it, it's nearly incomprehensible how many people are necessary to do this in a very reasonable time frame. So it's quite a lot of effort that goes into this.
What would you say has been the most challenging moment or aspect while planning for this conference?
The most challenging thing for the conference is definitely getting the balance between what the attendees really want and what we as Microsoft want to convey to them. So that providing the real deep technical content that strikes the right balance between what do the attendees need today and what do we want them to learn out of it for tomorrow. So getting this balance right is certainly a huge challenge from the perspective of the attendees. Then there are logistical challenges that just have something to do with the sheer size of the whole thing.
Now, did you take a lot of the feedback from last year's PDC in your planning for this year's?
Absolutely, absolutely. That was key. This was actually one of the starting points for me. When I learned that this year's PDC would be run out of my team, was the first thing I went to. I looked up all the feedback from over the last 3 years that was available to me and really studied it and took notes. And there were certain comments that come over and over and over again. So attendees really like to concentrate on the content and not have to deal with the logistics. So they don't want to deal with the fact that they have to stand in line with meals. This just has to work. Or that the buses are in time. This just has to work. All these things are just taken for granted.
The little things.
And the little things now just need to be there. So we develop a framework, a logistical framework within which the speakers then really deliver the content for the conference and do a great job with that.
Is there anything you would have done differently if you had to plan this over again?
I don't think there's very much that I would have done differently. Overall, I can say it runs very smoothly right now. We still have about a good day's work ahead of us till tomorrow afternoon, but so far things have run very smoothly, and I'm very happy about that.
That's great. So what would you say has been your most exciting moment so far this week?
Yeah. The most exciting thing are two things. First, when we came on site here, we saw this space. I mean, we have previewed the space and seen it many times, but then when all the stage goes up and all of a sudden an empty, naked hall basically comes to life and becomes the conference center, the way the attendees see it, and then ultimately the moment the cues are given for starting the keynote, that is something really cool.
Curtains unveiled.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great moment.
So I'm sure you've been really busy, but what do you like to do outside of work?
Outside of work, I'm a musician. I love to play music. I'm a trained classical musician because before I did computer science, I studied music.
Really?
And still play the French horn and do this during my free time. Obviously, during the time of the PDC planning, there was not much time for that, but I really look forward for picking this up again afterwards.
That's great. So, as if you didn't have enough to plan for, I hear that you're getting married this weekend.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
So your fiancée is, I imagine, has taken over the reins since you're busy with the PDC.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say that she takes over the reins. I hope it's only during the planning of the wedding. But who knows that?
Foreshadowed to come.
Yeah. So now we're having a lot of fun, and so while I'm doing a lot of planning here, she does a masterful job in really planning our wedding, and I'm unbelievably looking forward to this weekend.
That's great. So you have two major things accomplished soon.
Taking care of it all in one, and so afterwards I can relax and go on my honeymoon.
That's great. So what would you say is the thing you like most about working at Microsoft?
There are many, many things. I mean, for me, the most important thing coming from Germany, which is a very structured country, with lots of kind of restrictions in the freedom, the way you can work due to the strong presence of labor unions, for example. So everything is kind of regulated, has good things for them, has bad things for them. And that is, especially when you work in a creative job, like creating software or making something happen, there's something where you can't simply drop the pencil after 8 hours or 7 hours, 35 minutes and say, okay, I go home now. You just have to do what it takes to really make the things happen, and that sometimes takes 12, 14, or even 16 hours.
Right.
And I like this because the reward is so much bigger when you really say, oh, I worked the whole day and I go home and I look back and I know what I've accomplished. That's one of the greatest things. Besides that, obviously, the sheer enthusiasm for technology that I share. That's why I work in this industry, and that's something I really, really love.
That's great. So always changing, so there's always a lot to keep you occupied.
Yeah, and to learn, to constantly learn, never stop to learn. So with that, there's never a boring moment. What you know today is maybe obsolete definitely in 18 months. But maybe already tomorrow.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the PDC, the many things that we unveiled here, things that a couple of years ago we would have not even dreamt about.
Right.
Today they are reality, and we have to adjust to that and think beyond that. And that's very interesting and challenging.
Yeah.
So overall, I would say that the constant challenge, constantly seeing that there's something new coming up that you have to master, and doing the best you can every time.
Well, you're definitely doing a lot of that here.
Thank you.
So, Ulf, thank you for joining me today. I'm sure you have a lot to get back to.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of work left to do, but we are over the hump.
Well, congratulations. It's been great.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of the .NET Show. Hopefully we answered some of the questions you might have about the .NET experience.
It's been a great week here at the PDC, and we hope to see you next year.
And until then, we'll see you on the web.